So let's get back to day one and start off with the program. This morning, I'm thrilled that for an opening keynote, we're going to do something a little different in the form of a fireside chat. And I'm thrilled that Susan Gibson, who leads work in the government's Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, known as the PRAC, she leads their work group on identity, fraud reduction, and redress, and has agreed to speak with us today. So let me welcome in Susan Gibson, who's going to talk a little bit more about what's happening there. I also want to change, since we said it's a fireside chat and we're on Zoom, I have a special Zoom background just for our session where you'll see we are burning the things we really want to stop, benefits fraud and identity theft. So hopefully that helps to set the tone for a good discussion for the next half hour. But welcome, Susan. Thanks. Why don't you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about the PRAC?
I will. Thanks, Jeremy. Love your background. Thanks for inviting me to join you today. My thanks to the Better Identity Coalition, the ITRC, and the FIDO Alliance for hosting this event, and also, Jeremy, for your support of the PRAC's efforts to tackle identity fraud issues. You've been talking to us for several months, and we really appreciate it. For anyone who isn't familiar with the PRAC, it's a committee of 22 inspectors general, or IGs, that was formed under the CARES Act to serve the American public by both promoting transparency and facilitating coordinated oversight of the federal government's pandemic response and the associated $5 trillion in spending. The transparency goal is mainly supported by the PRAC's website, pandemicoversight.gov, where they've rounded up lots of pandemic spending data and all of the oversight reports and related information. They've made all of this information and data available and accessible with wonderful graphics, interactive search capabilities, and the ability for organizations to download a lot of the data and do their own analysis. There are also several targeted PRAC subcommittees and working groups. As Jeremy mentioned, I chair the PRAC's Identity Fraud Reduction and Redress Working Group, which was established last summer to focus on reducing the ability of criminals to obtain the government benefits on the front end, and also better oversight of the programs for redressing the harm to victims of identity theft and identity fraud. As Jeremy mentioned, the impacts to the victims just really, they're so much broader than most people consider, and the more you delve into it, the more troubling it gets. The IGs on the PRAC also work closely with the FBI and other law enforcement agencies to investigate pandemic fraud. To date, these efforts have resulted in over 1,100 indictments and nearly 400 convictions. While these results are impressive, it would obviously be better for everyone if we could reduce those numbers on the front end. It'd be better for the taxpayers, better for these programs, and so much better for the victims of identity fraud. So that's what my working group is trying to bring more focus to. And I'm thrilled to be here to talk about it today. And Jeremy, where do you want to take it from here?
Well, thanks, Susan. I wanted to start with the number you mentioned, $5 trillion in terms of the total value of pandemic aid. So our total GDP in 2020 was about $20 trillion, which means that's roughly a quarter of the GDP that was sent out during the pandemic response, which is a ton of money to try to distribute securely and accurately and quickly to people who need help. So I think we've learned now we didn't have the systems in place to do all of these things securely, accurately, quickly. What are some of the biggest gaps that you and the PRAC work group have identified on the identity side in terms of like what didn't we have in place then that we ought to really be thinking about now in terms of, a potential future crisis?
Jeremy, there's so much to talk about there. It's hard to know where to start. I think some of the things that weren't in place in particular were the general infrastructure to deal with this on this broad of a scale. As you say, $5 trillion is a huge amount of money, and it was spread across all these different programs. Some of them overlapped. Most of them were administered in a distributed way, right? It was the states that were administering the unemployment insurance programs. The PPP loans were individual banks. And so people were going in through all these avenues trying to get these benefits from the government. And when these different states and whatnot weren't talking to each other, I think it made it that much easier for the criminals to find those seams and gaps in the fraud protections. I think one of the reports that the Department of Labor, OIG, did found that one Social Security number was used to apply for unemployment insurance in 29 different states. So the ability to do that and not have at least one of those states, before they gave the money out, say, hey, is this social security number being used somewhere else? Something that simple wasn't in place. The problems compounded by old IT systems in a lot of the states that just wasn't ready to handle this. A bunch of state and federal employees who are now working from home and perhaps didn't have all of the resources available to them they would have had if they'd been in the office. As I said, it just goes on. And then everyone who's listening to this pretty much knows that authentication is just not where it should be in general. So when you add that amount of money, which is a huge target, I mean, how can the criminals resist? You add that amount of money without any improvements to the system and without the right data sharing. And I think this is where we end up, unfortunately.
On the data sharing side, I mean, you mentioned this, one person using the same SSN in 29 states. Are we seeing things in place now where that isn't still possible because we've put some checks and balances in place where, states can check with each other? Or are we still dealing with a lot of these issues, these holes that haven't really been closed?
I think some improvements have been made. I don't really have the data on whether all of these have been corrected at this point. I'd be surprised, quite frankly, because of the antiquated systems in some of the states and because of just the general attitude of states not wanting to sort of share the information in bulk. So, doing these one-off checks is a lot more time consuming and a lot harder than agreements to share in bulk. And sharing personal information, depending on a state's laws or the federal laws, can be very, very difficult. I think some of the privacy protections that were put in place before we really had the internet even don't work so well in this time and age. And I think we need to find new ways to share that information while still appropriately protecting the privacy. And when we get to that, where it can be done at scale, and not just one-off, which is hard to do when you've got the numbers that we've had during the PRAC. I think we'll start seeing more progress in this area. And I think it's something that in the future for these sorts of programs, Congress is going to have to think about, right? Hey, state X or bank Y, if you want to participate in this program, a certain amount of information sharing and data gathering and fraud protection and better authentication is going to have to be part of that before this huge amount of federal money is made available.
Mm-hmm. On that front, and I realize that the PRAC's still putting together its formal recommendations. Are there things that you guys are looking at that could be things that the government could potentially do, but where some new legal authorities are going to be needed to make it happen?
Oh, I think we're early on to talk about the legal authorities. Some of the things that I mentioned before, I think they're going to have to start tackling, and a lot of that's with the information sharing and the data gathering and the better authentication. Some of the other things you've mentioned already, so much of this happens online, and some of it you have to be pretty sophisticated even to use something like login.gov and always have access, remember your passwords, remember what email address you used when you first set up your account, things like that. I think, we need to remember that there's a certain population out there that just can't use the internet or won't use the internet or aren't proficient. So we're looking at some ways to provide in-person authentication, both to get the benefit, and then if they think they're a victim of identity fraud, also then how do you go in and authenticate that you're the real person and not the person who got your benefits? So those are some of the recommendations and things we're looking at. Depending on how that service is provided, that might require some legislation to authorize that and clearly to pay for it. So that would be an improvement that could be made. I think just requiring the sort of fraud protections that everybody knows are a good idea. This isn't a new problem. And if you go into recommendations that the IRS IG, TIGTA, has been making for over a decade, when this started with the tax returns and the fraud on the payments, they made recommendations on data matching. Why are you sending all of this money that's supposed to be for 5 different people to one bank account? So even looking at that kind of information. So those recommendations are out there. Some have been acted on. Not all. Again, the distributed nature of this with the banks and the states and the local and the feds I think complicates it. it's a hugely complex system and a lot of benefit programs.
I'd agree. Do we, the estimates that we've seen in terms of what was actually lost, particularly on the pandemic unemployment insurance side, numbers have sort of been all over the place. I know for a while there were people citing Labor Department IG numbers. The last number I think was 87 billion. There's been some private estimates saying it could be 400 billion, other numbers in between. Do we know what the actual number is, or if we don't today, do we think we'll have a good one in the future?
I don't think we have a lot of estimates. And as you say, the estimates vary pretty widely. We don't have a good number. It's one of the things that the PRAC is working on. If you look at all the data that they're gathering, that they're putting up on pandemicoversight.gov, if you start talking about all of the spending that has happened and categorizing it and tracking it, and try to look at that fraud as the investigations progress, I think eventually we'll get there. Of course, not all of the 5 trillion's been spent. So, we still have those programs to go. And some of the programs have different vulnerabilities. Unemployment insurance, we've talked about. A lot of individual identity theft and fraud is uncovered in the unemployment insurance realm. I think when you get to things like PPP that the businesses were applying for, we're going to see a completely different profile on that. Because again, those were businesses. I think we're going to see more synthetic IDs there and less identity theft, because it's easier to make up a business or to make a business look bigger than it is. Just stand up a shell and turn it into a business, if you will. Plus, those PPP loans, you don't have to start paying them back for 2 years. So I think when people start getting noticed to pay back a loan that they never applied for, that's when we're really going to start uncovering the PPP fraud. So that, I think that's in the distance. So I think it's going to take time to gather more data. We're working on it at the PRAC. Certainly hope to get there, but I couldn't put a number on it. That said, one of the things I tell people, regardless of which number you pick, it's blazingly obvious that we'd be better off spending some of that money on the front end, right? Not recovering everything and trying to stop it after the fact and going after the criminals, which we need to do. But if some of that investment could go to the front end, to better authentication, to updated IT systems, to working on the data sharing and putting the analytics in place so that you can uncover these fraud schemes and share that information, it would be a much better use of taxpayer funds.
Yeah. Now, I think you get to a point where when all of the numbers being thrown around are bigger than the Department of Homeland Security's annual budget, at some point the question becomes less a matter of, okay, what is the actual number? And okay, if we recognize this is a real problem, what do we actually do about it? Let me actually shift a little bit there. I want to dive a little bit more into identity theft and identity fraud. This is an identity conference after all. How is it that criminals were so able to easily steal money from programs using compromised or stolen identities?
Well, to some extent, I think given the nature of the pandemic and the nature of the pandemic relief, Congress was very explicit about the fact that they were more concerned about getting money out the door to people who needed it quickly. So some of these programs, people were allowed to get benefits just based on their own statement that, yes, I was a gig economy worker, for example. So even if that data matching had been in place, how do you data match somebody who claims to be a self-employed gig worker? So I think some of the efforts to get this relief to people swiftly, which were very well intentioned and obviously necessary, also opened the door to all kinds of fraud possibilities. And I'll go back to, you look at the states and the unemployment insurance, the huge amount of money, the IT systems that just were not anywhere close to being able to handle it. And the incentive for the criminals, who have a lot more resources, right? They've got smart people figuring out how to break in, and they've got a huge incentive for that. So I think you combine those good intentions, trying to get things out quickly, that just opened up new problems. And I tell people all the time, we still need to talk about identity theft and teach people how to keep their identities safe. But that horse has left the barn. There are so many identities that are already out there on the dark web to buy, and so many data breaches. I think the ITRC is going to talk next about that. And just the volume of personally identifiable information, the things that identify all of us, social security numbers, things like that, they're out there. So really, we need to focus less on trying to fix it by stopping identity theft, and focus more on how do you get to that authentication with a realization that the identity theft has already happened. That is a fact of life. Now that changes sort of what you have to focus on to stop this sort of fraud.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, the one thing we've talked about quite a bit from the coalition's perspective is it's time to perhaps, abandon some sacred cows, like telling people that they can somehow protect their social security number if they just keep their card locked up in a safe and don't give it to anybody, because you generally need to give that number out once a month because you're alive. And, life sort of, demands it, which, I've pointed out we were always sort of doomed to end up where we are right now with SSNs, where, shared secrets don't stay secret for long. But, the issue isn't necessarily replacing the SSN, but how do we build identity systems that don't ascribe any security value to knowledge of the social security number? It's just an identifier that happens to point out which Susan Gibson you are versus, I imagine, several hundred or several thousand others in the US. But just because you know it doesn't mean it's you. It just means that's, the one identity we're talking about. And also, as you're talking about this, I mean, I'm reminded it was around 2 years ago, I guess not quite at this time, but when things were starting to hit in March, and I started getting calls from friends and agencies, who I'd worked with when I was in government, saying, it looks like we're going to be getting a lot of money. What do we do on the identity verification side? Because we're going to be under pressure to get it out the door quick. And, we're worried about fraudsters. And I remember having a discussion with, a friend in one agency. This is a little bit like Donald Rumsfeld talked about with the Army when we, went into Iraq in 2003. He said, you go in with the Army you have, not necessarily the one you want. And I said, look, in the coalition, we've got a lot of ideas, as our policy blueprint in terms of what you can do in a couple of years to get better systems in place. But right now, you're going to have to scramble to leverage what we have. And I, think, unfortunately, we've seen, the results of that. But, talking a little bit about where we've been focusing from the coalition, if we had more robust digital identity infrastructure in place, when this started a couple years ago, let's say people had a mobile driver's license app on their phone that they could use. How could that have impacted things? How would outcomes have been a little bit different compared to what we saw?
That's not one I've given much thought to. I mean, you would hope there would be less fraud, right? I mean, if you've got better authentication, that should be an outcome of it. Getting to that point, I think, is going to be really hard. One of the things that we keep talking about inside government, and I've talked to some of the government research agencies about, is getting to this authentication. But at the same time, there's just no appetite, right, for some sort of a federal identity card or identity app or something. I mean, you even saw what happened when people thought they had to put their vaccine identity stuff maybe in an app on their phone. So that makes it difficult, right? The freedoms that we're expecting in this country, the way that people want to protect their privacy and their information. So I think if we'd had some of that in place, it clearly would have made a difference. I think getting it in place is going to remain difficult, and we're going to have to find some really creative ways to do authentication that are effective and acceptable in an open democracy like the United States. So I think that's going to be a problem. One of the interesting things that we're also working on right now, and one of the things we're turning to that I'd like to talk about before we run out of time, is also the impact on victims, and the fact that, we can talk about the fact that the authentication programs weren't in place. But the other problem is there's not absolutely nothing, but there's very little being done for victims of identity fraud, for the people who go to apply for their unemployment insurance and find out somebody got it ahead of them. So it takes them weeks or months to even get a call back when they report. And this is somebody who needs their unemployment insurance. By the time they get helped, are they also homeless? Are their children hungry? Their credit rating is a mess. You just think of all the things that flow from that, and really the programs are not set up at all. And I think that's the other thing that we found was woefully inadequate. People didn't even have a way to report, let alone a way to say, hey, this is the real me. Can you authenticate that it's me and give me the stuff that I'm entitled to? And so that's the other thing that we're really starting to focus on now in my working group, because as we're still focusing on reducing it on the front end, but there's nobody else hardly other than maybe the ITRC who's focusing on taking care of the victims. And really the government needs to be a big part of that solution because they're a big part of the problem.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, I may have mentioned to you before we were talking, this 10 days ago, my best friend called me. Somebody in DC had applied for unemployment in his name and he was aware of it. What do I do? And I said, you can call the ID Theft Resource Center. There's, law enforcement angle, but as much time as I spend in this space, people don't know what to do. And, going back to the issue of, what don't we have in place? I think you raised a great point. I mean, look, this is not something you're going to solve with a national ID card. In fact, one of the things we pointed out in our policy blueprint was it's kind of an outdated idea for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, it's a political non-starter, but two, part of our problem these days is we've got too many cards or too many physical documents, the passport, the driver's license, the birth certificate. They're all stuck in the paper and plastic world, and transactions are digital online. And, what we've been calling for from the coalition is not to create new systems that are going to raise security, privacy, civil liberties concerns, but just look to come up with some sort of a way to close this gap between the physical and the digital, so that much as I can go to a bank and by handing over my card to the bank, they know who I am or have a, to a, decent level of assurance. How can I present those credentials online or ask for them to be validated, ask for an agency to vouch for me? And so, there's where we think that there's, an important role for government to play, since government's the only authoritative issuer of identity, while still respecting some of the boundaries that we've had and not creating, new systems that are going to raise some of these bigger concerns. So let me, we don't have a ton of time left on this panel, but, let me ask, in terms of what's next from the PRAC, what sort of recommendations on what government should do here, do we expect to see coming out from your work group and the PRAC in the months ahead?
I think you'll see a lot of the same recommendations that we've seen already, unfortunately. And a lot of those are all rolled up on the pandemicoversight.gov website. IGs are doing the oversight to make recommendations for improvements. Everything that we've been talking about, better authentication on the front end, data sharing, really paying attention to those fraud indicators. The same IP addresses, the same physical addresses being used multiple times, social security numbers used multiple times. So I think we'll see recommendations along those lines. For the PRAC, we're also looking ahead. Like I said, my working group in particular is now really shifting its focus to the victim end of this, because that seems to be the part that has so little focus at the moment. Most people would have no idea if you're a victim of identity fraud and theft. It's the FTC that has the lead on that, of all things. And when you go there, you basically get a checklist. They'll help you put a checklist together, and you get through all this stuff, and it's your job to recover your identity. For some people, it's a nuisance. For other people, that's nearly impossible for them to do on their own. And again, all of the harm that could happen. So we're turning to that. We're going to keep doing recommendations. We're going to keep rolling them up. I mean, the PRAC is an organization that includes a lot of individual IGs. And so what the PRAC tries to do is take those individual reports and roll them up and and distill them into sort of the higher level. Okay, what should we tackle, and what are we seeing across programs that we need to focus on first? Working with OMB so that they can start making those changes, working with Congress. They're starting to ask the same questions you are. So what do we do? What do we fix? Where do we go to now? So we're looking to get those answers together. Some are staring us in the face, and you just keep saying the same ones over and over. But there's value in that, right? People are talking about it. That's a good thing, and paying attention. And the amount of money that's involved is going to keep people's attention, and I think that's important.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point you made too, when it comes to, what do you do if you're a victim? I mean, part of my dream is that how do we shift this away from giving people what, tools and what they should do after they've been victimized, to giving them something that they can use upfront to protect their identity, and better asserted online so they don't become victim in the first place. But
Absolutely.
that's one of the things we want to explore today. Susan, I know we're right at time. I really appreciate you coming to speak with us today. Thanks so much. And, please keep us updated as you all making progress, and let us know how we can help.
Hey, my pleasure, Jeremy. Thanks again for having us. And I look forward to, I'll be looking at most of them later, but I look forward to several of the presentations that are coming up. So have a great forum. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much.